So hello, I'm François. I'm a French web developer, and I work at Fadio IT. And today I'm going to speak about going reactive with React. So in this presentation, I try to demonstrate that even if React brings a lot of great evolution, it didn't do so much for event management, and that we can achieve better model with React and RxJS. Then I speak about other field of application. So I really like React, and not only because the framework is so great, but also because when you think about it, there is not a lot of fields in web development that has not been affected by React or related projects this past 2 years. I mean, since we've started using React, we've gotten rid of our old string template for JSX, and that's great because now we can use the full power of JavaScript to declare the UI of our application. We replaced the old MVC pattern by the simplicity of Flux. And since the arrival of projects like Falcor or GraphQL, the day of rest are over. Even things as fundamental as CSS has been challenged, and new model has been introduced based on JavaScript. And 2 years ago, I think nobody even thought it was possible, but that's React and the community around it who brought it. And much more. I could list all this evolution all the day, and it will take all the talk of the conference. But what about event management? I mean, it's what we do on a daily basis. Every day we manage events. What did React bring us for event management? So let's look at a very simple component. It's a counter component. It displays a number and a button. And when the user clicks on the button, the number is increased. So let's try to describe precisely what's happening in this component. When the user clicks on the button, the on-button click handler is called. It sets the state of our component, which triggers re-rendering. OK, seems good. Pretty simple. Now, let's look at the exact same component, but written with Angular. And if you try to describe what's happening in this component, the same description still applies. The user clicks on the button, the handler is called, it sets the state, which triggers re-rendering. And even for older framework like Backbone, we have the exact same description. So the conclusion is that React have not done much for event management in these past 2 years. But perhaps it's because it's fine. Perhaps this model is perfectly good, and that we are happy with it, and that's why it didn't change. So let's look at just a slightly more complicated example. It's very naive drag component implementation. And if we try, like for the other component, to describe what's happening there, it becomes a lot more complicated. When the user presses the button of the mouse, the on mouse down handler is called. It sets the mouse is down intermediate state to true, and a down pause intermediate state for further calculation. When the user releases the mouse button, the on mouse up handler is called and sets the intermediate to false. Then, when the user moves the mouse, if the intermediate state mouse is down is set to true, it will update the state of our component, which will trigger a re-rendering. So even if it's really a simple component. I mean, it's far from being representative of what we can find in real application code. Even with that, it's really hard to describe what's really happening in our component. And we can see that there is a couple of problems. Firstly, the logic is really fragmented. I mean, the logic is all over those handler, and it's fine here because it's a simple component, but more your component will become complex, more it will be hard to put those handlers in the right order when you will want to maintain your component. Also, it introduces a lot of intermediate state. And again, this component is simple. It has only 2 intermediate states, but if you have more and more events to manage, you will have to introduce more and more intermediate state. And it will become really hard to maintain the synchronization between those states. And finally, and I think that's the biggest problem, the relationship between our component state and the user input is not established at all. I mean, when we say that this is a drag component, we can, with word, perfectly describe what is this relationship. Our component state is where the user dragged our component. Nothing else, nothing more. But in our code, this relationship is not established at all. By reading the code, you can't understand what is this relationship. So, can we do better? Can we find a better model that will get rid of all these problems? Actually, this model already exists, and it's called RxJS. So, there were a great talk of Paul Taylor yesterday about Rx, which will avoid me to spend a lot of time explaining what it is. But just as a reminder, Rx is mainly 3 things. Observable, which are push-based collection. Operators, which are like operators that you will be able to apply on your observables. And scheduler, which controls when a subscription starts and when the notifications are pushed. In this talk, we won't talk about schedulers so much. So, we can create observable from almost anything, a WebSocket, and especially, we can create observable from events. So, if we try to implement our very simple component, counter component with RxJS, firstly, we create an observable from click. So, this observable will push a new value each time the user clicks on the button. Then we apply the start with operator on our observable, which will prepend a value to our observable, which is 0 here. Then we apply the scan operator, which will just run an aggregate function on every value pushed by our observable and push intermediate result. And what's cool here is that with just these 3 lines of code, I describe the state of my component. I pretty much know that the state of my component is just an aggregation of click events. And then I subscribe to my component and do the rendering. If we look at our drag component, here again, we have an observable of mouse down event. Each time the user mouse down, it will push a new value. Then we flat map this observable, which means we will create a new observable sequence for each value pushed by this observable, and we create this sequence from the mouse move observable. We map it to the location we want to obtain for our component until the mouse up observable push value. And here again, the state of our component is clearly established. And we clearly know what is the state of our component and what is the relationship between the state of this component and the user input. So this model has a lot of advantage. Firstly, it has a lot of coherence. The logic is all at the same place, and in the good order, you can pretty much read sequentially the instruction of the operator that you applied on your observable and understand what's happened. Secondly, intermediate state are no more. They're implicit. I mean, the most is done, intermediate state is still there, but we don't have to manage it anymore. And finally, like I've shown on the previous slide, the relationship between the state and the user input is clearly established in a declarative way, which is great. So now the question is, how can we combine React and Rx? How can we get advantage of both of those great libraries? So we can do it manually, and that works perfectly. To do so, we use a little trick of Rx, which is subject. A subject is an observable that also implements the observer contract, and it has an onX method. Each time you call this method with a value, it will push this value. So here's the idea, is to bind the value pushed by the same observable sequence we created earlier to the state of our component. We apply start with operator on the on button click observable. We apply the scan operator on the result. Then when we subscribe, instead of rendering our component directly, we just set the state of our component. Then, when the component will unmount, we will have to dispose this subscription. Finally, you can see in the render method that I don't pass directly the on-button click subject to as callback for the on-click handler, but a function that will call the on-next method of the on-button click subject. So it's fine, but it's a little verbose. And for this reason, I created a little project called RxReact, not really original, which is just a collection of helpers that will help you combining React and RxJS. So RxReact has a lot of different little helpers. It's really teeny, but mainly there is two things. Func subjects that are collab subjects, and the state stream mixing. So, func subjects are callable subjects. When I create my func subject, I create a function that implements the observable interface. And calling that function is exactly the same thing than calling the onNext method of a subject. This has been designed to be used as event handler, live-seq method, or even for ref. The state stream mixin just binds the state of a component to the value pushed by an observable. When you apply the state stream mixin on your component, you have to implement a getStateStream method. When the component will be mounted, this method will be called, and the state stream mixin will bind the value pushed by the returned observable to a component. Then, when the component is unmounted, the subscription is automatically disposed. So until now, I only used Quick class. And you can do the exact same thing with the new S6 class. RxReact provide a base class called RxReact component. But actually, like you can see in that example, it's based on inheritance, which is not a great pattern, and I still need a better way to do things. Alternatively, there is a project called React Rx component created by Andrew Clark that take a complete other world and which is based on higher order component. So with React Rx component, you separate your component in two. The higher order smart component that will implement all the logic, and a dumb component which will merely return JSX element for given props. So in this example, which is still our simple counter component, we can see that when we call the create Rx component that come from the React Rx component library, we pass a function. This function will receive an observable of props. Then we can create, like with RxReact, some func subject. We can define the relationship of our state and user input with observable operator. And we return an observables. Each time these observables push new value, those value will be pushed as props for the chill component, which is a dumb component, and just do the rendering. Here, in this sample, we use the combined light test. We just take multiple observables, and each time one of them push a value, call a function, and push the result of that function, and push the result of that function. So, once you started to use Rx, you will want to use it everywhere. It solves really so many problems. I mean, the learning curve is not easy. At start, you're quite lost, and even myself, the first time I have seen the project, I thought it was dumb. But once you start to use it more and more, you see everything as observables and operators. And there is a lot of things you can do with that, which are not related to binding the state of a component to an observable. So, still with event management, what we can do is pre-compute some event before calling an handler. Most of the time, you don't want to have stateful component. You want to have components that can be controlled from the outside. So, for example, here is a very simple slider component. It takes two props, value, and unchanged. And each time the user moves the thumb of the slider, it calls the unchanged callback. What we do here is, again, we're creating observable and define what are the value that the unchanged callback will push by combining those observables. But instead of binding the state of a component to the value pushed by this observable, we will just call the callback. Another thing is Flux. If we look at the classic Flux implementation, we have a dispatcher which push action over time. And we have a store which aggregates this action and push intermediate result. Here we can see a very dumb store. It's a count store. I love count things. And it registers to the dispatcher. And when it receives increment or decrement, it increments the count or decrements the count. Very simple. But that looks like a lot what we have seen in the other sample that was bound to state in our component. And in fact, in a way, app dispatcher and store is a lot like observables, and you can completely implement Flux just with Rx and nothing else. If you do so here, the dispatcher is just an observable, and a store is just the result, generally, of applying the scan operator on this dispatcher. Finally, your component can just bind their state to the value pushed by the store. You can also do animation with Rx, which is pretty cool. Basically, the idea is to create an observable that will push over time the different value we need to render the component of our animated component. In this example, through the repeat operator, I create an observable that will push 0 on each animation frame, all the time. I apply the scan operator that we have already seen to increase a degree value. And I bind the result of this observable to the state of my component. Then, on the render method, I can easily just use that degree value for the rotate transformation of my component, and it will turn on itself. Also, there is a lot of easing function that has been implemented by Paul Taylor and that you can find on this address. Basically, you create observables that directly will push a value with the easing function of Robert Penner applied. So in summary, React is great. It comes with a lot of great evolution, but it did not change how we manage our event. And clearly, there is a better way today to do so, especially by using RxJS and React. Thank you, if you have any question.
Thank you very much. Let's look at the question side.
So, in fact, so for the first question, in fact, you can completely implement regex with just few lines of code and few usage of the operator. When I have shown the scan operator earlier, it's basically all you need to apply a reducer on a value and push intermediate results. And to be honest, I never tried M or just for little things, so I don't know. I need to try first to know if it's better than Rx.
Cool, great, thank you so much.